Okay, so now we're up to adding these little seed beads in here, the black and white stripes across the top section and along here on the bottom. So I've threaded a needle ready to go, and that's these sections in here and up here and across this side as well. So I have two colors here of size 15 seed beads. They're both my Yuki. It's the black 401 and the white 402. So I'm just going to pour a little bit of these out on the mat. You notice when I spread my beads on the mat, I don't leave them in a little clump. I like to spread them out a little bit. It just makes them easier for me to pick them up when I'm using them, if they're spread out a bit. And I don't put too many beads out on my bead mat at a time, so that I don't end up in a mess with lots of bead soup. I prefer to put out a few more beads here and there than end up in a pickle. Okay, so I'm going to start here. Bring my thread up, just doing a little lock stitch so that I don't lose my thread. Now, what I'm going to do here is just create a little bit of tension by pushing my thumb onto those beads. I don't want them to get out of line when I'm adding in the color. And I'll use my needle a little bit to measure how many beads. So I think it's going to be 3 in here. 3 is going to fit in that gap nicely. So I'm going to do 3. Now I've laid those down. One's sort of sitting up a bit funny. It'll be the position of where I've put my thread down. Just using my needle there to space them out nicely. Pull a bit of tension again. You can see they're sitting nicer now. Now what I tend to do when I'm adding a small amount of beads like this, more so than a back stitch if I was doing a long line, is I couch over them. So I've laid them down where I want them to be, and now I'm just going to bring a thread up and head over just the thread between the beads to anchor them into position. And you can see you can go over each little bridge if you need to. If you're only adding a couple of beads at a time, I find that adding in that little gap, if you just went over one of those little bridges between the beads, it would be fine. So you can see there, they're sitting where I want them to be. Now I think it may be 2, maybe 3. No, I think it's another 3 beads in that little gap. And I'm just going to come up and couch those into position. There's something about filling in the sections that seems to adapt to couching better than the 4-bead back stitch. I find anyway. Do what works for you. If you'd prefer to do a 4-bead back, a 2-bead or a 3-bead back stitch in here, by all means go for it. Nope, I've gone over the wrong side of the bead there. It's a good example of a couching stitch gone wrong. Straightening that up, guiding the thread where I want it. Now I'm trying not to push those beads too far apart. You can see it's sort of flaring a little bit here. I'm trying hard not to flare that out too much because I don't want to lose the outer shape of my heart. Some people cut out their embroideries to stop that happening. I find I can still end up with it flaring out even if I cut out the design. And I tend to like my beads much more pressed together and all cramped up. I just prefer that look. Some people prefer to have a bit of space of the foundation showing. It's just personal preference. Go with what works for you. I'm in the middle here, and I just want to make sure that I either have a white or a black in the middle, straight up and down in that spot. And so I'm just coming up right in the middle there. Going to be the black ones, checking with my needle. Is that what's going to fit in this gap? Yes, it is. Now it's not sitting as straight as I'd like, and it's because these beads here are already sort of in its position. I'm just guiding them a bit. I put the needle through and sort of straighten them up a bit. Now I'm just going to couch over them, give them a little bit of extra tension to get them to stay. I think that went through a white bead then, but that doesn't matter. Oops, the needles come off. You can see that's how that's starting to look. Thread my needle again. And I'll just tie that so it doesn't keep coming off. Now you'll notice that I'm sort of along here, I was keeping the beads at this sort of an angle. And as I come back up this side, I'm going to fan out this way and then bring them up at this sort of an angle. If you feel you need to draw that on with a grey lead or a gel pen, just grab a pen and you can sort of draw yourself a little guideline to follow those angles, if that helps. Okay, so on this side, I've added all of those beads in, and now I'm going to couch over each of those little bridges. You can see that it's got a little rogue bead. It's not sitting so good. Do the couching stitch, and it just tells that bead to sit where you want it to. Make sure it's going over where you want it to go over. That one's misbehaving. There we go. There we go. Black and white across the bottom, all done. Now we're going to come up and do the same thing here. So I don't know if you can see that on the filming very easily, but there is little lines there of the angles of where each of these stitches is going to go. I'm actually probably going to start in the middle here and work my way back, and then come back to the middle and work my way back. Just know then that the angle of this one in the middle here is going to be in a really nice spot. I'm putting the beads onto my needle just to check the length fits in that gap. And I've got 4 beads there. I'm going to come back up in between the 4 beads and just go over the middle to hold that where I want it to be. Now I'm going to start working down towards this way. And I'm starting to place my needle a little bit further out on this side and in as close as I can on this side. And what this does is just accommodates for the curve that we are traveling around. If I didn't do that, I'd get to a point where the beads were always up against each other, and I get to a point where they wouldn't follow the curve around. So I'm coming further out down here to compensate for that curve. And I'm trying to go in really close on this side. And I'm just couching that into position each one. The other thing you can do if you're not sure about the placement of or the angles is you can pull the beads right down on the thread, lay the beads in the little gap, you know, lay it on there, work out where you want your needle to go so that they sit nicely, and then bring the needle down. Sometimes I find when I'm using smoke fire line with white beads, if I couch over them, you don't know that I've used the smoke fire line. I don't mind the shadow that it creates between the beads. I find it gives it a more antique look. I'd actually prefer to be using smoke fire line than the white. A lot of people like the crystal fire line better. Oops, I'm meant to be using black beads. They like the crystal better because you don't get the graphite coming off on your fingers. Yeah, it doesn't bother me so much. I don't mind it. You can see I'm starting to fan those out a little bit. They're spaced further apart here and closer together here. So I just tested that before I put those beads in there just to see if 3 beads was going to be too much, or it's starting to get narrower, and it's like borderline too much. But I've just used my thumb to really push those beads in to where I want them to be. We're definitely down to adding 2 beads in that gap because you can see this line here starting to bubble. If I wanted to, I could break one of those white beads out, but I like them nice and crowded, so I'm going to leave that there. 2 beads fits quite nicely in that gap now. I think 2 beads is going to be too big in that gap, and they're sort of sitting a little bit wonky. Just giving them a chance now to fit in again. And because they're actually sitting quite wonky, I might have put my thread just a bit in the wrong spot. So don't be afraid to, if you don't like where it's heading, just come back a stitch. That's okay. Also, don't be too hard on yourself. If this is the first bead embroidery that you're doing, it is quite a complex project. So if you're finding it tricky, it's probably because it is. Just adding single beads in now, and there's nothing to couch over. So now this here, I kind of want that swirl part there to sort of kiss this other gold bit. And I might even just couch over the middle of those few beads there to make that happen. I'm going to add just one more white. And I'm looking for a nice skinny one. That to taper down together. And now I'm just going to, oops, I'm going to fumble. No, I'm going to just couch over these gold beads, bringing them together. Another thing to be mindful of when you're doing your bead embroidery towards the edge of your work, it's you need to think about where your thread is on the edge, because you don't want to cut that thread later when we trim out this heart shape. So you'll notice that when I'm heading in, I'm couching over these, but I'm heading in at this sort of angle. I don't want my thread, my stitches to end up on the outside of this line, because we're going to cut right up against that. And if I did, then my beads would start to fall off. So you'll notice I'm heading in at quite an angle, right up next to the beads, but through the foundation there. I think we can probably put one little black bead in this little gappy here. I think that looks quite good. I'm very happy with that. So now I'm going to come back up here and head back in that way. And coming back up where I want to be. Sometimes when you've moved across the section, it takes a few goes to get the needle in the spot you want. Now you'll see there the knot that I did earlier to hold that needle on has just come undone. So it took quite a few stitches before it pulled the needle off the end with that little knot. And my thread is getting quite short, but I'm going to try and use as much of that file line as I can before I add another one. So back to adding 4 beads in this little gap. You see I measured those beads to see if I had the right amount of beads on my needle before I put them on. Again, I'm coming further away on this side and close together on that side to accommodate for the curve, because we're adding straight lines into a curved section. All right, so I think I've got a few too many beads in this one here. It doesn't want to sit down flat and it wants to bunch up a little bit. Can you see that bead just bunching up higher than the rest? So say you've finished all your embroidery in that section, you go back and you look at it and you go, oh, there's a rogue bead there. He is not sitting where he should be. I need to break that bead out for the other beads next to it to relax. I just want to show you a quick trick that you can do to get that to go out. So I'm getting my beading awl. It's a Tulip brand beading awl. This one here. And it's got a point here, tapers. Yeah, and this is called the M. Maybe it's a medium point, perhaps. I don't know. It's the navy blue one. Anyway, fabulous little tool. And I'm just going to push that into that little bead. I'm covering my finger over it because I don't want glass to shatter and get in my eye or in the room. Hear that little click? That is the bead has shattered. And there it is. I can just break that little bead out. So if you've got a bead that is in the way, you can get rid of that. Another little trick you can use for getting rid of a bead that's in a position you don't want is using an eraser and a good old drawing pin. So these work just as fabulous as the more expensive Tulip beading awl. The other good thing about this is if you're doing something in beadwork that is a bit more three-dimensional, it gives you something to push the pin into. So you put the eraser behind the work that you're working on, you line up the bead that you don't want, you put the pin into the bead. Again, I'm putting my thumb over it this time just to stop that bead from shattering into my face. Again, hear that little click as the pin goes into the eraser, and give it a little shake. Out comes that naughty rogue bead that was in the wrong spot. Now I've just broken two out of there and I didn't need to. So take my needle off, go back a stitch. I'm going to take all those little pieces of glass and just put them in the bin. Two beads in that gap is much nicer. Now, can you see that black bead there that's pushing these ones out of shape? I think he needs to go. Now, when I was heading in this direction, I thought it looked really good. Now I think he is being a cheeky little bead that needs to go. So what I'm going to do, get out my handy dandy pin and break that bead out, and you can see those beads have relaxed and I get that nice line back. Okay, if you've broken a bead out, you might find that you need to go back and reinforce in there. I also have a little spot there where I'm going to add a little white bead in that gap where there's like a triangle shape where the beads are fanning out and there's more space on the outside. So I don't really want to see my foundation there. I'm just going to come in and add one single little white bead in that gap. And I'm super happy with how that's looking. So now what we need to do is do the same thing as we did here on the other side. Okay, I'm quite happy with how that's looking. So that is the black and white sections complete. When we come back, we're going to be adding colour.